I very thoroughly traumatized a therapist to the point where she left the industry. The biggest problem in childhood was early molestation. So my mother was drugging me. I found out that this police officer that had trafficked me made me famous on a pornography website. It destroyed me. That day on the bathroom floor was the beginning of the end for any kind of alcohol. I had to go through a lot more stuff first, unfortunately.
Amanda, welcome to the Inside Addiction podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I am excited to be here. This is a little outside of what I normally talk about, so this is exciting for me.
Awesome. So why don't you start off by just telling us a bit about your background and life growing up and some of the challenges you had when you were a kid in terms of addiction?
So most people know me as a survivor of human trafficking. I'm very outspoken about that. And I live here in beautiful, absolutely gorgeous Colorado with my husband and our 6 cats. That's a lot. So we've got a very full life, but this is not what my life has always looked like, of course. The biggest problem that I faced in childhood was early molestation. When I was 4, was the first time it ever happened. It was my older brother. We had some kind of behavioral issues at that point. So my mother took us into a medical practitioner. And at the time, it was 1984. And all the craze was about kids being put on Ritalin for getting them to sit still in the classroom and not have behavioral issues anymore. And what nobody knew was that a lot of our behavioral issues were stemming from something else. For me specifically, it was molestation. And I believe it was the same for my brother. I was 4, he was 7, and there's no way he should have known the things that he knew at that time if he hadn't been given an education. So we obviously had a lot of stuff going on in our lives already. So when my mom took us into the doctors said that I was fine, but my brother had ADHD. So they gave him Ritalin. My mother didn't believe the doctors, so she started breaking my brother's pills in half and giving them to me every day. And when that happened, of course, she was doing it illegally. She was drugging me. And this was because she didn't want a rambunctious child with minor issues. She wanted a zombie child because she didn't know how to deal with a kid with problems. A year later, she took me off of the medication for a few days so that she could take me back into the doctor and manipulate the doctor into believing that I had a problem. And of course, as a 5-year-old with a drug withdrawal, I was pinging off the walls. I couldn't sit still. I was jittery. This happens. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you have a drug withdrawal, this is something that you're going to face. And when the doctors gave me my own prescription, I just went along with the program. I was 5. I didn't know any better.
Yeah.
I took myself off when I was 15 years old. I was a teenage runaway at that point because, of course, the issues had escalated because they weren't addressing what the real problem was. When I was going through all of this at 15 years old, I didn't know what a drug addiction was, much less a drug withdrawal. I was running away from home. I was hiding out in the woods. I was going through horrible things, trying to figure out what was wrong with me, because absolutely there had to be something wrong with me. I was the only one feeling it. And it wasn't until years later I figured out what that issue was. But when I ran away from home, a kid running away from home doesn't think about taking their medication with them unless it's something that they need to sustain their life.
Yeah.
I didn't need the Ritalin to sustain my life. So when I got back, my parents took me into a psychiatrist that they had already sat down and talked to. And they had set up the groundwork for making the psychiatrist believe that there were all of these issues that I was dealing with. They believed I was sexually active. I was not. They believed that I was taking recreational drugs on my own. I was not. And they kept on telling the psychiatrist that I was depressed and I was suicidal, and I was not. I was certainly depressed, but I was not suicidal. And the psychiatrist then, upon our first visit, told me 2 things that kind of set me up for a consistent failure. And the first one was, if you want to have a relationship with your father or any man in general, you have to like what they like. And that set me up for a really hard life of a lot of abuse for a very long time until I learned how to break that cycle. And the other thing was, we can fix you with more drugs. And she put me on Klonopin and Paxil and Prozac and other substances that at the time I really didn't need because I was just going through a drug withdrawal. I
Yeah.
was sorting it out. It was brutal. I refused to take those also, and I was flushing them down the toilet every day because I had just gotten myself off of the Ritalin. I wasn't going to start something else. I was
Yeah.
terrified of taking pills.
And as a 15-year-old kid, how was it for you trying to work all of this out between the experiences you've had? You didn't know you knew that that wasn't the right thing, and then the doctor and the psychiatrist and your parents all recommending another option and more drugs. Where were you at as a 15-year-old kid trying to figure all this out?
I was in the self blame department. There were so many things wrong. And my mother used to tell me all the time that if there's constantly something wrong in one person's life, there's a common denominator. So I had grown up believing that if all these problems were existing in my world, that I was the problem. So even though I wasn't taking the drugs, I started to tell myself that they're trying to put me on these drugs because they're seeing that there's a problem with me and I need to change. And I have to change these behaviors. I need to have a better relationship with my parents. So I have to pretend to be somebody else. And I started doing all this just trying to figure out how to cope with my world. And a couple years later was the first time I was ever trafficked. At that point, I had been so conditioned that I believed that if somebody was telling me to do something, I didn't have the option to say no. So there was a lot of correlation between being put on all these medications and drugs to being trafficked the first time because it set me up to be weak minded. It set me up to think I'm the only problem here. If there's anything that's going on that I don't like or I don't want, it's my fault anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the first time you were trafficked, what was the circumstances, the situation? Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, ironically enough, he was a drug dealer. He was more than twice my age. I was 18, he was in his 30s, and I lived with him at the time. So, because I was a teenage runaway, I had no proper high school education. I was having a hard time just trying to make enough money to eat, much less to take care of myself. Nobody wanted to hire a high school dropout. Hadn't done anything with my life yet. So I got a job at a 7-Eleven, and this man gave me a place to live. And because I was so depending on him, he was able to manipulate me into doing things that he wanted me to do because he knew that I had nowhere to go. After the very first time he ever trafficked me, basically, he traded me to a buddy of his for some undisclosed item or amount of money. Um, I was locked in a hotel room for 52 hours and raped and assaulted repeatedly over that period of time. And when I got out of there, I knew I had to get out. I had to leave. And I did what I could. I was more willing to be homeless than to continue putting up with what it was that had just happened to me. I had already been assaulted so many times in my life, starting at when I was 4. It picked up again when I was 12, all the way through until I ran away from home. This was nothing new to me, but at the same time, I wasn't ready to keep going down that same path. But I was trafficked 3 different times in my life. So that first time, it only lasted for that very brief amount of time in my life when I was 18. The second time, I had gone to Florida to go and stay with my grandmother. She was going to take me in while I got knee surgery. I had injured myself while working on a horse farm. And when I got all the way down there, it was about 10:30 at night. I was standing in the Daytona Beach bus station. When I called, her husband, my dad's stepfather, answered the phone and said, "We're not bringing you home. We're not coming to get you. You're on your own and good luck."
Wow.
I couldn't understand why for a long time. It wasn't until many years later that I found out that my parents had called her and said, she's running from her problems again. And if you take her in, we'll never speak to you again. And they manipulated the situation. Specifically, my mother manipulated the situation. She's always been very manipulative. She was emotionally manipulative with me from a very early age. So I ended up sitting there on the curb at the Daytona Beach bus station in Florida. I had $5 to my name. I was in a state I'd never really spent much time in before. And a young couple came up to me. He was 22. She looked 18. Turned out she was 15. And they told me that they had a place for me to come and stay until I could get on my feet. But what they really meant was they had a place where I could come and stay until they found the highest bidder. I don't know what I was traded for that time. I believe it was somewhere in the realm of $90. That's what my entire life was worth.
Wow.
And I managed to get out of a room after being locked up for 23 and a half hours with no food, no water, no bathroom facilities of any kind. When I got out, I ran. This is what I had become really good at, was running away from the problems, from the dangerous people, from the scary people. And I ran as far as I could. And as far as you can get basically without a passport out here from Florida, East California. And I ended out there for a number of years. And in 2004 is when internet dating really became a big thing. So when I was trafficked, it was 1998 and 1999. So in California in 2004, when internet dating became all the rage, is when I met a man who lived in another country. But we knew that, nothing is obviously going to happen here with us in a relationship because we live too far away. We both have established lives. At that point, I was finally doing well. I was on Alias. I was on Will and Grace. I modeled for Harley Davidson. I was doing a lot of really cool stuff in LA. He had an established job. He was very well respected within his community. He had a child, shared custody with his child. He had his whole family. We couldn't really give up everything that we were doing to go and be with each other. So we decided we were going to be long distance pen pals. And over a period of 7 years, we got to know each other quite well. Eventually, he came to visit me and I went to go and visit him. And we decided in 2010 that we had fallen in love with each other. And he asked me to get a fiance visa and to move to Scotland to go and be with him. And in January of 2011 is when I moved to Scotland. The snowflakes were as big around as the palm of my hand. They were massive. It was snowing so hard. And I got out of the plane, and within 2 hours, we were back at his house. He already had my passport, my debit card, all that stuff. And he said it was for safekeeping. He was going to literally put it in a safe in his house. And with him in his particular career, I trusted that he knew more about safety than I did. He was a police officer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It took him 7 years to get me there. It took him 7 days to start trafficking me. It was awful. It was the worst thing that I had ever experienced in my life, in spite of everything that I'd been through. But the first 7 days were beautiful. I got to go wherever I wanted as long as he was with me. I got to visit with whoever I wanted as long as it was his family. I got to experience things. I got to see the history. We don't have history quite that old here in the US, especially on the West Coast. And it was, oh gosh, I fell in love with the beautiful scenery and the kindness of the people. And I loved it there. And then when the trafficking started, I just wanted to go home. I just wanted to leave. I did what I could. I was trying to put together some kind of a plan. He had all of my documents. And finally, I told him, I said, if you give me back my passport and my debit card, I can go down to the bank and see if I can get all my money out, which was just a little over $2,000, so that I can, give it to you and we can spend it. And he went for it. I had made sure he was well and truly drunk that night before asking him for this stuff. And he went for it. And then he forgot that he'd given me my stuff. And I got the first flight out that I could afford, which was 5 days away. I had $11 left to my name after buying that ticket. But the abuse occurred so frequently And it was so severe that I ended up with a kidney infection and was in the hospital when that flight left that day. And it was a non-refundable flight. So I became incredibly desperate and I wanted everything that I was going through to go numb. And I remembered when I was quite young, I remembered how the Ritalin made me feel like I was numb. Like it didn't matter what was happening to me. I'd get through something because I had that as a crutch. And I knew I didn't have anything like that there in Scotland. And he was a police officer. He wasn't going to go out and give me drugs, no matter how illegal everything else was. But we had plenty of alcohol. And I started drinking a lot. I was drinking extremely heavily. I was chasing a blackout drunk. I never got to that point. I unfortunately had to remember everything that I was going through, whether I was drinking heavily or not. But having had that much alcohol made it a little bit more bearable. When I did finally manage to get out of there, I mean, there were suicide attempts. There was the lost plane ticket, and there was a lot of lies, a lot of confusion, all on my part. I got very good at lying, very good at pretending to be somebody that I wasn't, just trying to get through it. And when I left there, I told myself I was never going to drink again. But that's, of course, it's not what happened. I got back to California, barely. I escaped with my life. And he came hunting for me, of course. And I remember looking through the peephole one day and seeing him banging on the neighbor's door. He had my address off by one number, but he had come all the way out to California to look for me. He was hunting me. I was so scared. And I didn't know what to do. I had a massive roommate at the time. The guy was 6'2" and kind of broad shouldered. He was a pretty big guy. And I told him that I was scared and I didn't know what to do when he told me to come back inside and, or come sit down and just relax and be calm and quiet. And if he came to our door, he would lie to him and tell him that I wasn't there and it would all be okay. And that roommate and I had way too much to drink that night. And a couple of nights later, I found out that another man that I had once loved very much was engaged to be married to somebody that he'd gotten pregnant. I don't think I've ever talked about this before, not out loud anyway. But I found out that this good man that I'd loved was so successfully moving on with his life. And I was still stuck in this intense, incredible amount of pain. And I just wanted him back. And it wasn't because I wanted him, because we had both moved on with our lives. I wanted that sense of safety that I had when I was with him because I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't know how to manage everything that I was going through. And I went to the liquor store and I bought a bottle of Jack Daniels. And I don't remember my roommate picking me up off the bathroom floor and putting me in bed that night. And I don't remember him pouring the rest of the bottle down the drain. It wasn't much. And I had finally achieved blackout drunk. And it was the last moment, the last time I ever got drunk in my life. I said, I'm not doing this anymore. I can't do this to myself anymore. I'm going to die like this if I don't stop. And I'm incredibly blessed that I never had to get the medical help that I probably should have gotten back then because I couldn't afford it. But I did stop, right? That moment I stopped, never got drunk again. I said, I'm completely done with it. And I wouldn't even go to a party where I knew alcohol was going to be for something like 10 years after that.
Yeah, that's amazing that you were able to stop drinking. And like you say, you had that rock bottom moment when you realized you didn't want to drink anymore, you didn't want to get drunk anymore. And when you're in that situation, you said you mentioned that there was a good man who had moved on in his life, but he was someone who made you feel safe. Who was that man in the story? Who's that man? Tell me a bit more about him.
Ironically enough, he was another police officer. He was a highway patrol officer there in California. His name was Pete, and Pete was a good man. We were obviously not meant for each other, but it was at that point the healthiest relationship that I had ever been in my life. He didn't scream and yell at me. He never raised a hand to me. I had been through so many abusive relationships because I had been raised to think that this was a normal thing. And when I met him, it took me a long time to understand that this is more what a healthy relationship should look like.
Yeah.
He helped me to understand that enough that I have to give him credit for having the healthy marriage that I have now.
Yeah. He gave you that frame of reference. He showed you what's possible. He changed that kind of narrative and showed you that there was a different option. He showed you, Amanda, you don't have to be in these relationships and that there is a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And he deserves all the credit in the world for that. And I'm happy for him that he found somebody. He's been married to her since then. They have a little girl now, and they're, I do my share of, I guess, internet stalking. I just check up on him every couple of years or so. And it's not because I'm still in love with him, because I'm not. I haven't
Yeah.
been for a very long time. I still love him dearly and always will because of the good things that he did for me in my life and the good things that he taught me.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference from being in love with somebody and still loving someone.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And recognizing the impact they had on your life, right? And how that had that positive ripple throughout your life.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. He was a huge part of my life. I was with him for 3 years. I
Yeah.
mean, how do you just take an entire 3.5 year period of your life and flush it down the toilet and say, well, that never existed? You can't do that. It is always, good or bad, is always going to be a part of you and a part of your life because you learn something from these experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Amanda, you went through a lot in your life, right? You've been through a lot in your life with the different incidents of trafficking, the relationships, the abuse on many different levels. Was it at that moment with the Jack Daniels when he passed down the floor, you decided to stop drinking? Was that the moment you decided to sort of start to recover? How did that journey happen to go from all of that trauma to where you are now? Fill us in that gap. What are some of the things you've been doing to help heal that trauma and those wounds? What's that look like?
It took a little bit longer than that for everything else to happen. I mean, that day, that was late 2011. That day on the bathroom floor was the beginning of the end for any kind of alcohol, but it wasn't even close to being the beginning of actually coming through rock bottom and really healing as far as trauma. I had to go through a lot more stuff first, unfortunately. In 2016, I packed up and left California forever. I moved to Colorado. I've been here ever since. And in 2019, I found out that this man, this police officer that had trafficked me, made me famous on a pornography website. And on the website, he included social media information and personal home address information and telephone numbers and whatever he could find on me. He made me famous overnight. And probably the lowest point in my life was when I was asked for my autograph in a grocery store. Not because I'd been on Alias or Will and Grace or because I'd modeled for Harley Davidson or any of the cool stuff that I'd ever done, but because this man saw me being raped in a pornography video. It destroyed me. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know if I wanted to survive this. I had already been through so much. I thought I had left it all behind me. But really, unless you face and deal with your trauma, you're never leaving it behind you. This was just another one of those reminders. It was very much in my face. And I reached out to a couple of anti-trafficking organizations out here in Colorado. The first one paired me up with legal services to be able to help fight these pornography websites and have this stuff pulled down. The other one paired me up with a therapist that I then very thoroughly traumatized to the point where she left the industry. So then they paired me up with another one who actually had experience working with survivors of trauma, survivors of human trafficking. And it was very important to find this. And I told her right off the bat, I told her, I don't trust therapists. And this is why. And I told her about the therapist when I was 15 and how she'd been preconditioned by my parents and how the first thing she did was put me on a bunch of drugs. And I told her, I said, number one, do not come at me with medications. Been there, done that. And I'm not looking for a Band-Aid. I'm looking for a shovel. All you're going to do with medications is mask the problem. And number two, do not treat me like I am some fragile porcelain doll. If I was going to break, I'd have done it already.
Yeah.
And going in with that kind of an attitude, knowing that I was at rock bottom and all I was going to do was slide sideways without this help, knowing I needed to dig out of this hole that somebody else had dug, was the first step to really understanding where I'd come from, everything I'd faced, and how to get out of it. And a year and a half of intensive therapy with several different versions, including EMDR and tapping. We got through all of this stuff. And that was really the beginning of all of this healing for me. Since then, I've come out with my 13th book. I'm a trauma recovery mentor. I help people to understand their own trauma reactions. I've studied all of this stuff so hard because I needed to understand where I came from and not just who I am and what all this stuff has done to me and how trauma transformed me into somebody else entirely. I needed to understand how this stuff happens to other people and why other people do the things they do. It was so important.
Yeah. And amazing. Well done, right? You've done so amazing from where you've come from. And I want to get into the books and all the great work you've done. But one thing that I see and I recommend to clients myself as a therapist, and I think that's really important, is finding a therapist that has some understanding and experience and like knowledge about what you're going through. I mean, what was your therapist, like you say, one therapist didn't have such a good experience and the amount of trauma you spoke to her about was difficult for her to handle. But the second therapist, what was her background? What was her situation? Tell us a bit more about her and how you felt that fit was between you two.
We never really got too much into her background, but I could sense that there was some kind of a trauma there, and it made her want to reach out to other people. She had been through something. She experienced something that made her more receptive and understanding when people were talking about some of the difficult situations they'd been through. She got together with this anti-trafficking organization because she knew that she could make a difference, because she knew there were other therapists out there who didn't know how to speak with survivors of trafficking specifically.
Yeah.
I have to suspect that there's something in her past, either rape or molestation, or possibly even trafficking in her past too. She had to work through something to be able to listen to what it is that we were telling her.
Yeah.
And she was working with several of us at once.
And I think that's really important to have someone who can really help you and support you. And what was that like? You said a year and a half of therapy, having EMDR therapy, lots of different intricative approaches and modalities. I mean, how was that for you personally to go through that experience of having all of that therapy?
I was terrified of it at first. With my history of the therapy from when I was 15, of course, there's this underlying fear anyway. But I had heard about EMDR and I looked at it as some hokey thing. This isn't going to work. This isn't real. And when we started it, the associations that we're building and the things that I was able to connect started to make a lot more sense. And it's like, this is weird. I'm not sure how I feel about this actually working and doing something here, but I started to become a little bit more open to it. And when I became more open to it, it started working more. And then it really scared me. But it was great. It was amazing how these different forms of therapy all connected in their own ways to help me move over a speed bump or a hurdle or whatever it was that was getting in my way of being able to move beyond that part of my past, to be able to heal from that, to be able to forgive people from that, and to walk away and say, this is no longer going to control who I am.
Yeah, yeah. And as time went on, you went through this therapy, and at what point did you start to decide to reach out and help other people and start writing books and that kind of stuff? Of course, you had that moment, when you realized that you'd been, published online, and that was obviously horrendous, and started to get that taken down. And I listened to some of your other podcasts and stuff, and it was at that moment you realized everyone kind of knew a lot of stuff. So that gave you, in some sense, permission, or I'm not going to use a word, I want you to say what word that would be, but the opportunity, or you decided in that moment to then share your story yourself and help other people. Tell us a bit more about that.
Oh gosh, the moment I learned how to talk about my own past was the most powerful moment. I mean, I started out very quietly. I would post on Facebook that nobody ever knew this, but I am a survivor of human trafficking, and that was it. In this post, I would get some responses of people that wanted to encourage me and help to build me up. And my best friend in the whole world was probably the first and the loudest voice. And she encouraged me to speak up more and more. And I had been writing all of my life. My first book actually came out in January of 2018, my first book in my name. I was very proud of that. But when all of this stuff happened in 2019, I wanted to go into hiding. I had just at that point released my fourth book. So it was an average of 2 books a year at that point. And I was humiliated. Here's my name out there attached to these books, and here's my name attached to all this stuff on these pornography websites. People are going to find me. But I heard it said so many times that there's no such thing as bad publicity. And it's not because being through everything that I've been through was bad publicity. I mean, this is terrible. It's horrible to have to go through something like this. But I knew that if anybody could spin it to something positive, I could. And
Yeah,
if people were going to be finding me because of what he's done, then they're going to know why they're finding me, because of what he's done.
yeah. And you
That
wanted
was
to
one
share
of the,
that other side of the story.
yeah, absolutely. That's when I really started hearing a lot of people coming forward and really wanting to support me. There's been very few instances ever since I first started learning how to talk about it where people have said that it was my own fault. One of them, of course, was my mother, but she has no part in my life anymore. But she absolutely blamed me and said that I had made poor choices. I had one really horrible review on my autobiography when that came out. I believe that was the man who had trafficked me, just from certain things that were said and the way that things were worded. I had one person on Twitter, and I had one celebrity that I met. He didn't know how to deal with it, so he just turned around and walked away. Those are the only negative reactions that I can ever remember receiving. Most of the time, people look at me with tears in their eyes and say, I want to hug you. Can I hug you? And that's such a beautiful moment because I know when that happens that I've reached that person. I have touched their heart and they understand that this is not something that needs to be seen as shameful. This is something that needs to be seen as a strength. It will never, in my mind and in my heart, it will never be considered a weakness to ask for help. It is a strength, and that's why it's so hard to do.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned with your mum, you don't have a relationship now. What was that like, based on all the different stuff you've been through? What is your relationship with your parents like, and how has that been over the years?
Oh gosh, it was so tumultuous. So I mentioned earlier I started running away when I was 15. I went back when I was 20 for a week's vacation, I believe, or 21. I had a baby with me at the time. My son had just been born. My ex-husband stayed home, and I went out there and went to go and visit, and it was rough even then. Ended up going back to my ex-husband with my baby and having this little life kept on trying to kind of build a relationship with them. Every single time I told somebody that I don't have a great relationship with my family, they kept on telling me, oh, you need to try harder because, this is the only family you're going to ever get. And I kept on thinking that can't be true. It can't be because, I got married, had a baby. That was my family. I built my own family. Surely there's other ways to do this too. And I can break these ties with these people that have abused and manipulated me most of my life. But maybe they're right. Maybe I should try one more time. And I did this over and over and over and over again. And when that highway patrol officer and I broke up, I went home to my parents. And I stayed there for 3 months, 4 months. It wasn't long. I needed to get the heck out. I could not stand to be near them anymore. That was the last time I ever saw them in person. And the last time I ever actually exchanged words with them was in an email with my mother in 2013. She found out I was in the same state as she was. I was there for flight attendant training. And I set this email up to her and said, hey, I love you, but I can't allow you to be manipulative and abusive. These are my guidelines. These are going to be my healthy boundaries. I was finally starting to learn what healthy boundaries were. And right now, what I'm asking is that I'm here studying. I'm here doing something that's very important. I graduate on X date. If you like, I will invite you to the graduation and we can sit down afterward and discuss everything. But I ask you to respectfully wait until then to say anything, because number one, I need you to think more about it than that. And number two, I've got other things that I need to worry about right now. Within 10 minutes of sending this email, I received from her one of the most hurtful things that I ever could have gotten. She reminded me of one of the most painful moments of my life. And I told her I'm done. If you cannot respect my boundaries, you have to understand that there are consequences for your behavior. It's not just one way or the other here. You have to pay these consequences now.
And what was
And
it
as much
like
as it
making that
hurts,
decision? How did you find that?
oh, it hurt so bad. But it didn't hurt because I was letting her go. It hurt because I was starting to finally realize that what I wanted more than anything in my life was a family. And that was something I would never have with her. I'd never have that with my father. I knew that this was probably goodbye for good, that I would never see them again. And it hurt. And it never stops hurting. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't the right decision. Yeah. It hurt to quit drinking physically. It hurt to take myself off of the pills when I was 15. It physically hurt me. That didn't mean that it wasn't the right decision. It hurt to go through therapy, but it was the right thing to do for me. I needed to do these things to be able to have a better life.
Yeah.
And letting her go hurt so bad because I knew that I could never change her into being the mother that I needed.
And like you say, sometimes the most important but challenging decisions hurt. Like you say, therapy, it hurts. Going through and changing is painful. Sticking to your boundaries, it hurts. Sometimes it's not always the easiest choice or the most happiest, beneficial, pleasurable choice. But like you say, it was a choice that you needed to make for you to have a healthy boundary and to raise your own standard of what you required from relationships.
Absolutely. It was the start of really discovering who I was outside of trauma and outside of all of this pain that I had been experiencing for most of my life.
Yeah,
These were huge steps in the right direction.
yeah, yeah. And in terms of steps you took, so boundaries with your parents was a big one, having therapy was a big one. Is there any other steps along the way that you feel like have made a big impact on where you are today?
furthering my own education on human psychology was a huge step. It helped me to start spotting different red flags in relationships and getting prepared for, hey, the other shoe's about to drop, without having to go through other shoe syndrome. So other shoe syndrome, for the people that aren't aware, is where you are expecting something bad to happen just because things are going good. But when you start to recognize the red flags, you don't have to wait for the bad things to happen. You know that this is a predecessor to the bad things. This person has manipulative behavior. He is going to get more manipulative as time goes. You have to learn to listen to those red flags. There was one particular dinner date that I had years ago where the man in a public restaurant got upset with me for something that I'd said. And I won't go into details of what it was, but he lunged at me across the table like he was going to choke me. And he threw his hands toward me and stopped. And people everywhere were looking at our table because he had made such a quick movement in my direction. And I got up and I walked out, walked to the nearest gas station, called an Uber because he had been my ride. And I went home and I locked the door. And he stayed outside of that 7-Eleven for the longest time, waiting for me to come out, expecting me to come out, knowing that eventually I would have to, and thinking that he was going to be able to manipulate me back into being in his car. But after seeing that one red flag, I absolutely spotted the signs that this is an abusive person. This is not somebody I need to be spending any kind of time with. I need to get out of here right now for my own safety. And there's so many warning signs that I had ignored over the years that led into abusive situations that I didn't need to be in. And if I had listened to those red flags, if I had learned how to spot these signs, I could have saved myself a lot of problems.
Yeah. And for our audience out there, what are some of the red flags that you feel like you've spotted over the years?
Emotional manipulation is a huge one. But since I grew up with it, it was really hard for me to distinguish because this was something that my mother did so frequently that I believed that this is what happened in relationships with people. Later on, learning that if somebody says, if you love me, you'll do this for me, whether it's taking another drink or going somewhere you don't want to go, it can and usually does lead to something much more dangerous. It was part of how I was manipulated and frauded into human trafficking. Was, you'll never have to do this again if you do it for me this one time. That's almost always a lie.
Yeah.
Don't buy into it. Somebody who raises their hand, whether they hit you or not, whether if they throw something across the room toward you, whether they hit you with it or not, this is a sign you have to get out, because the next time that might actually hit you. And eventually it will. Any acts of violence that this person portrays, any, can and usually will spill over to their romantic partner. You have to look for this stuff and you have to get out, no matter how much it hurts. You can choose to do the easy stuff your whole life and you can have a hard life. Or you can choose to do the hard stuff your whole life and have it easy.
Yeah. And Amanda, I have to ask, how do you get out? How do you do it? How do you do it when you're so in that situation, in the abusive relationship, in that cycle of abuse? How do you get out?
There are so many different ways. Probably the biggest one is to ask for help. When I was in Scotland, though, I didn't have anybody that I could turn to for help. He was the police. I couldn't go to the police. The people that he brought over were judges and lawyers and kind of higher up officials and random people that he met at the grocery store. I never knew who anybody was, but I did know that I couldn't go to any of them for help, of course. They're there taking advantage of me also. I had no help except my religion. I'm Christian by faith, and I believed that God was watching out for me. I went to the train station one day because I had planned on taking my own life. And I was a smoker at the time, and I took with me one cigarette and was sitting there at the train station waiting for the train to show up so that I could head towards the train and throw myself onto the tracks and be done. And I pulled out my cigarette and was smoking it. And a man walked out onto the platform and he asked me for a light. And I know you've heard my other interviews, so you've heard this story. But this man asked me for a light. And when I handed him my matches, I told him he could keep them, that I wouldn't need them anymore. And I wanted him to ask why, because that was my way of asking for help. I didn't know how to say the words yet. But if somebody had asked me what was wrong, I would have told them, this is what's happening to me. And I'm terrified and I don't know if I want to survive anymore and I need help. And I just want to go home. But he didn't ask because he didn't care. I could not make this total stranger care about yet another total stranger. It was not his problem. And then his little boy walked out onto the platform and walked up to his dad and took his hand. And this little boy looked at me and he looked through me and he saw me. And it was, honestly, it was the first time that anybody had really seen me in possibly years. And it was scary because he looked at me like he knew me and I didn't even know myself at that point. I was so lost in this world of pain. But I knew from the way that he was looking at me that I could not do to him what had been done to me when I was about 4 years old. And that was to steal the innocence of a child. I could not commit suicide in front of this child and destroy him and his soul. And I could not allow him to see what I was planning. And I ran back to my prison and I kept on thinking my whole way back that if I was going to be kept alive in this moment, there had to be something more to my life. My life has to mean something more than this. And I started putting together a plan. And what nobody knew about me was that because of everything that I had been through, I had been on my own studying different forms of psychology and psychological terms and stuff. And I had learned about this thing that we used to call Stockholm Syndrome. We now call it trauma bonding. The Stockholm Syndrome to me was fascinating. How can these people learn to love an abuser or somebody who has like their life in danger like this? I hated this man that did this to me, but I needed to make him think that I didn't. And I started leaving these little breadcrumbs of making him believe that I truly loved him and would do anything for him. And he started to buy into it. And eventually, after months of this manipulation of my own, and fully understanding that with him being a police officer, he would also know what Stockholm Syndrome was, I led him down the path of thinking that I would truly give up anything for him, just to be with him, just to make him love me, just to get his approval. And eventually I told him, I said, I came over here on a fiance visa. And we didn't get married on the day that we had said we were going to get married. And eventually my visa is going to run out. If I overstay, I can get kicked out of the country and not be allowed back. And you could lose your job as a police officer if anybody found out. But if you send me back to California, I can go and stay with friends. And I can come back in 6 months. And I'd be back in time for Christmas. And wouldn't it be wonderful? It'd be our first Christmas together. And within 2 hours of that conversation, he had bought a round trip flight to get me back to California and then back to Scotland in early December so I could spend Christmas with him. And of course, as soon as I got back, I split. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I had truly started to develop Stockholm Syndrome. And because of that, when I got back, there were several people who didn't believe that what I had been through was abusive at all and that I lied about it. Because if I cared about this man, if I missed this man, then he couldn't have been that bad at all after all. I lost friends. I lost jobs. I lost so much because I'd actually started to develop Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bonding. And it was a wild ride. I just wanted to convince him that I had it. I didn't want to convince myself that I had it.
Yeah. And you learn about trauma bonding and, like you say, Stockholm Syndrome. And how has that served you in future relationships, that understanding and that knowledge that you have and started to cultivate? And obviously you've left that particular relationship and you're now in a different place. What does that look like?
Oh, it's amazing. I haven't ever had to use that same trick again, thankfully. But a lot of that has to do with having these healthy boundaries and learning how to watch for those red flags and how to cultivate healthier relationships. But another big one was starting to study trauma reactions like Stockholm syndrome. You know, that's absolutely a trauma reaction when you start bonding with the person that is abusing you. But all these other trauma reactions that were building all these neural pathways in my brain, I was reinforcing them by allowing this bad behavior to continue.
And
I
just give us
had
some
to,
examples. What would be some examples of trauma reactions?
my hypervigilance is probably the biggest one that I still struggle with even now. There's a bunch that I've had, like eating disorders and all kinds of problems. But the hypervigilance is a really big one. I believed that I was an empath. So many people confuse empathy with hypervigilance. It's a huge, huge issue. When you walk into a room and you can pinpoint the person that's in the worst mood, it's not because you're an empath. It is because you're hypervigilant and you're trying to pinpoint what is the biggest threat to you. How do I neutralize it? That's a huge one for me. I still have wandering eye syndrome where I look around the room and I have to know where everybody is and I have to know where the exits are. But in a lot of ways, I find that to be helpful. So I haven't worked so hard to fight back against that one. But there's so many different trauma reactions that we've had to deal with. The need for control is a big one.
Yeah.
I used to have this massive need to control everything in my environment. And what I didn't realize was that I could only control a small percentage of it. You know, I can tell the car where to go by having my hands on the steering wheel, but I can't control where the road goes and I can't control how many potholes there are. Somebody else has built all this stuff. Somebody else has dug these holes. I can try to avoid the holes. Those are healthy boundaries. But life is going in a particular direction, and that's always going to be forward. I cannot control time. I cannot control the streets. I cannot control what somebody else does or thinks or says. I cannot control any part of somebody else. All I can do is control my reaction to them, not their reaction to me. So, in my need for control, I discovered, of course, writing, but also painting, cooking, all of these things that we have as creative outlets give us a better sense for a need for control and allow us this creative outlet to be able to express that need for control without actually trying to control our environment around us. I stopped trying to be the controlling force in relationships of mine, whether they were friendships or romantic relationships was beside the point. I wanted to control everything. And I started letting that go. I've also had a huge problem with people pleasing. This is a massive trauma reaction that so many people don't even realize that they have. When I was studying in 2013 to become a flight attendant, I did become a flight attendant. I did it for 2 years, 3 months, 28 days. Not that I was counting. It was a great job. It was the perfect job for a people pleaser. But as my personality began to change and alter because I had recognized myself as being a people pleaser, I learned more that this was not the most appropriate job for me. I was losing that people pleasing behavior and I could finally start to let that go. And I ended up leaving the industry for several reasons, but it was honestly, it was the best decision I could have made for myself. I had this inability to ask for help because I had been through so much that I believed that I could only rely on myself. I could not rely on anybody else. And now, you know, I a lot of times I don't even have to ask my husband for help. I hand him the jar of mayonnaise or whatever it is. Here you go. He just opens it for me. He just knows that I'm asking for help. But every now and then I'll be like, hey, Kyle, can you come help me with something? Yeah, not a problem. I know I can depend on him. And that was huge when learning to break that cycle of behavior too. To find people that you know are reliable And you start by asking them for small things first. You know you can reach that ink pen, but ask them to reach it for you. It's little things. You can retrain your brain into learning how to ask for help. And it's amazing what you can go through. I mean, anxiety disorder, all kinds of issues that I've had, eating disorders. Of course, I did have a crisis of faith. I got involved with an atheist for a little while because I wanted to know what that was like, because how could a God let me go through something like this? But we live on a fallen earth. You know, we're not in heaven. We have free will. And which way are we going to ask it to go? Are we going to say, hey, God, take away everybody's free will so evil things don't happen anymore? Or are we going to say, hey, God, thanks for free will?
Yeah, yeah. And I think one thing in terms of free will that really comes up for me in through the lens of you is that sense of you've now decided to implement those health tools, to go to therapy, to write, to cook, to do art, to do loads of amazing things in life. And the free will works in the positive as well as the negative, right? And we can start to create the positive compounding in life and the new neural pathways and the positive reinforcement, having healthy boundaries. You know, when you ask Kyle now to open the jar, he doesn't throw away your head, I'm assuming, right? He goes, yes, of course, dear, and opens it for you, right? So you're creating those new neural pathways, which is really, really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to reinforce them, though. I mean, this is a repetitive behavior. You have to keep doing this. Right? Just because you're working on it a little bit, just because you went through therapy doesn't mean your whole life is going to change. You can't go to therapy and expect somebody to wave a magic wand and say, okay, you're all fixed. That's not
Yeah,
what it is. It's a lot of work. It's
yeah,
work that is absolutely worth it, but you've got to be willing to do the work. You can't expect somebody to do it for you.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And for you over the years, what has that work been like? You mentioned some of the tools, writing, cooking, art, therapy. Is there anything else that comes setting boundaries and actually like putting things into practice, which is so important? But is there anything else that has over the years that has really helped you kind of start to heal from some of those trauma reactions of the hypervigilance, eating disorders, people pleasing, anxiety? Like, what's some of the things that's helped you sort of start to rewire those in your brain?
Well, all of that stuff and podcasting, as
Yeah,
weird as that sounds, in 2020, I had been, because of everything that happened in 2019, I had been a member of a small group of survivors here in the state of Colorado. And we were getting together once a week and we were doing life skills classes or art classes or whatever classes. And having that sense of community was really important to me. And I didn't realize that. But sitting in a room full of people who get it makes all the difference for some people. We didn't have to talk about our issues, we didn't have to talk about the past. We didn't have to go into any of that. But we had people in the same room who weren't going to judge us for having gone through it because we knew they had to. When the lockdown hit, I lost that sense of community. We didn't get together anymore. Some of the other survivors didn't have computers, so we couldn't even do like Zoom meetings and hang out. It was none of that. And I lost all of that. So I started my podcast in 2020. And originally it started out with me just either sitting in my closet floor or inside my car, whining about having to wait at the DMV forever, and talking about different things that had happened in the past. And the second year of the podcast, I went through reading my autobiography. But the third year of the podcast is when everything shifted. I realized that it's not about me. It's not about my story. It's about hope. So I started interviewing other authors who had survived traumas and then had written about them, because I wanted to be able to offer that message of hope to other people and to show them whatever the trauma is that they've been through, they're not alone. There's literally thousands of stories out here of people that have been through stuff and have come out the other side and have worked so hard to go through the recovery. And what it taught me was not just that I needed that sense of community and I missed that community, but that if they could fight back against this trauma reaction that I was still struggling with, that there was hope. I wasn't just giving hope to people that were listening. I was giving hope to myself.
That's amazing. And, you know, I love podcasting. We're on the podcast now, right? It's such a amazing way to have such great conversations with people like yourself, you know, and so many amazing guests and stories, you know, we've both heard and different people we've had on both of our podcasts, which is really amazing. And I mean, Amanda, tell us a bit about the work you're doing now in terms of trauma and what you're up to. Give us a bit of the lowdown. Tell us where you're at.
So I am proud to say that I have 3 different podcasts. One of them is talking about trauma reactions, what the long-term consequences are of not fighting back against them, and then how to fight back against them to help retrain your brain. That is syndicated on Australian radio. Yay.
Oh,
My co-host is in Australia, so we kind of have an in. I have my primary podcast, of course, The Survivors, and that one is the one where I interview authors of trauma. The other one is all about phobias. So it's not so much related to everything, but it can be in ways. A lot of people discover that they develop phobias after going through trauma. So all of this stuff is kind of my way of wanting to reach into the homes, into the ears of other people, and to kind of teach them different stuff about, hey, you can fight back against this. And it's okay to ask for help to get there. But I also have a trauma recovery mentorship for the people that are like, you know what, this podcast is a little bit helpful, but I need a lot more help than that. And my mentorship, I do one-on-one, I do groups, I do pre-recorded modules where people can go through and learn a bit more about their own individual trauma reactions and how to fight back against them. And I go into a lot more detail with this stuff. But the one-on-one is by far the most helpful, not just for them, but for me as well. You know, I want to see somebody's face. I want to be able to interact with them and to kind of tailor any kind of care that I'm giving to that specific person. You can go through the modules all day long. You can go through groups all day long. You're always going to get the most benefit from having somebody who's working specifically with you for you. I love doing that.
That's amazing. And I too myself, you know, we offer counselling, one-to-one counselling and the video program and stuff, but sitting one-to-one with someone, like you say, it's just gold dust to me, right? You know, even these conversations, you know, one-to-one sessions is really important. And, you know, I recommend to anyone listening, and if any of Amanda's stories resonating with you, go and check out her mentorship, right? All the links going to be in the description, as always, to her podcast, to her mentorship, but go and have a talk with her. And see what light she can shine on your situation. I think the work you do, Amanda, is amazing, and all of the work you put out into the world and just supporting people through this journey is really, really good.
Thank you. Thank you. It took me a long time to get here, but it's worth it.
And as we come towards the end, is there anything else you want to end on or share or talk about before we come to an end?
I usually always have people ask me about my book. And they say that singular, not plural. Even though I did just publish my 13th book, my top seller will always be, I think, my autobiography. So the people that are curious about that, it's called Custom Justice. You can find it on my website, and that'll be in the show notes too. But probably my biggest takeaway from all of this is that I learned a long time ago that the famous saying by Friedrich Nietzsche is all a lie. His famous saying was, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That man died in an insane asylum not too long after that. We can let that one go. The truth is that strength is in us. It does not belong to, and the credit does not belong to abusers and traumas and hard times that we go through. The credit lies within us. We were given the gift of having that strength to get through it. We are the reason that we got through everything that didn't kill us. It didn't make us stronger. We made us stronger because we had that determination.
Yeah, beautifully said. I definitely second that, right? We have that strength. And one thing that really stuck out to me about your story is that like hope, right? Even in the darkness and even when things are so shit around you, there's still that little bit of hope that things can change. Like it's a possibility. I don't know how, I may not even believe this even possible, but for me personally, I was like, I know that it can be different. I know they can be different. Don't have to be using drugs every day, just heading towards death. I don't have to be in this situation. For me, I knew even if I didn't believe it, and like I say, even if I couldn't quite understand it, I was like, it is possible. There's a version of reality out there where my life is different, and working towards that is really, really important. So thanks for being so vulnerable and playing so full out and bringing that, to the podcast. It was really, really touching. And it meant a lot just to even be privileged enough just to hear that, Ryan, just to listen to it and to listen to everything you've been through and how you've come out the other side and how you have such a positive impact. And I think the hope piece, right, the instilling hope in yourself from the whole journey you've been through, and also the hope for other people. People listen to the podcast when in those dark situations, in those down days, and these stories really have a big impact in people's lives. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing and being vulnerable. And I really personally value that vulnerability and that honesty and like how shit things are, because that's the truth, right? And that's what people connect with, because they're like, fuck, that's me too, right? So I just really enjoy putting it all out there. So thanks so much for being so vulnerable.
Of course, thank you. I mean, honestly, I don't think I've ever cried that often on a podcast before. So that was very real. It was cool. I don't think I know how to be anything else. And thank you so much for having me, Luke. This has been such a cool experience for me.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, thanks very much, Amanda.
Awesome. Thanks.
Cheers, Amanda. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.